Great. So let me just start by saying that, well, thanking you for inviting me to give this talk, first of all, but also you asked if I would like to be interrupted or do the presentation first. What I've actually done is taken a talk that I gave at the Operational Research Society conference a couple of years ago, and I've pruned it back quite substantially. So hopefully there's enough time for questions at the end if people will just let me go through the presentation first. So I want to talk with you about the systems theory of marginalization. And I'm going to cover a couple of things. I've been actually working on this theory for over 30 years. It's actually 30 years now, 1991 that I first published on that. And it's been kind of growing and adapting over the years. I also want to talk, though, about strategies to challenge marginalization. It's all very well being able to diagnose it and understand what causes it systemically, but I've gone over about 95 odd projects in preparation for this and other talks I've done on marginalization, and drawn out examples of systemic interventions. But some of those strategies actually have dark sides. They can actually have negative side effects, and it's worth actually talking about those as part of this. So I'm going to start with some very basic theory on boundaries. And I'm going to do something that is perhaps not too legitimate and summarize 50 years of work from Wes Churchman and Bernard Ulrich and myself on boundaries in 3 minutes. So obviously it's going to be a reduced version of this. Now we can start by saying that most systems approaches make the assumption that everything in the world is either directly or indirectly connected to everything else. But we can't have a God's eye view of that interconnectedness. Our view is always partial. And in the English language, the word partial has two meanings, and both of those meanings are relevant. So partial means limited. It's restricted our perspective, but also partial means informed by values. And by values, I don't mean general principles like kindness and generosity, and I don't mean universal values either. I mean what matters to a person in the context of action. So all our perspectives are bounded in the sense that they're both limited in what we're taking into account, and they're also values informed. And this diagram here is a visual modeling language that helps us represent boundaries. So the oval that I'm using my cursor here to point to represents the inclusion of stakeholders and the issues that concern them, and obviously also the exclusion of stakeholders and issues. And the peak here represents the values, what matters to people in the context of action. You can see also that there's a two-way arrow linking these two things. That's because there's a tight relationship between values and boundaries, such that purposes and values help people in drawing boundaries, but also we don't come into the world as autonomous thinking subjects who can just make up any kind of value or boundary judgment. We come into institutions that already have boundary judgments that they're using, and those can sometimes constrain the values that it's possible to express. So anybody who's been around a little while in organizations has probably worked in a setting where there are certain undiscussables, and if you name the elephant in the room, it can rebound on you quite negatively. That's precisely because of these boundary judgments that are enshrined in institutions and prevent certain things, certain values being expressed. In practice, though, I tend to go in and talk about values first, because the first thing often people think about when they hear the word boundary is constraint. Of course, in systems theory, we're aware that boundaries simultaneously enable and constrain. So they'll enable something and constrain other things. but often exploring values helps open up the possibility of different boundaries that people might see. So that's a kind of starting point. But now I want to actually use this modeling language to help represent marginalization. And I think through this next diagram, you'll be able to see how I think marginalization operates. Now that might be difficult to understand, first of all, so I'll walk you through it. You'll see there's a narrow boundary judgment where I'm pointing my cursor with a set of values associated with it. And there's a wider boundary judgment here, likewise with a set of values associated with it. What's between the two boundaries, what's excluded by one group but included by the other, is what's marginalized. The value judgments come into conflict. So let me talk you through an example, and it should become clear. So let's take the example of unemployment and the unemployed. We might think of a boundary judgment being made by an industrial organization. It's a good ethical employer, it looks after the welfare of its own employees, but it's not particularly interested in the unemployed in the local community. It's just not their business. And then you may have a campaign group in the local community who really do think that that should be the company's business. They're concerned about unemployed people in the local community, and they say this is a big employer, it's an anchor institution in the community, they should have some responsibility for unemployment. In that situation, both the issue of unemployment and the unemployed themselves become marginalized. So you see the two sets of values, full inclusiveness in the community, looking after our own in the organization, come into conflict. And what I realized looking at a number of different scenarios of marginalization when I first did this work back in the early 90s, I realized that when this sort of thing happens, those kinds of conflicts often don't get resolved. They often get stabilized and entrenched. And I began to look at what was causing that. And I realized that strong attributions, strong value judgments are made by whatever's in the margins. And I use those terms here, sacred or profane, not because they're meant in a religious sense, but because it illustrates the strength of feeling that goes with those kinds of attributions. So you have those people in the industrial organization who begin to talk about the unemployed as lazy scroungers who are just taking our tax money and they're not working for it. And that's essentially making the unemployed profane. That justifies them operating with their narrow boundary because they don't have to kind of think about those wasters. Then you've got the campaign group in the community who say, if only we can harness the energy of the unemployed here, we'll have a new political movement and we can make real change. And they're essentially putting the unemployed on a pedestal and making them sacred. And there's rarely a consensus on whether things in the margin are sacred or profane. It's a contested space with different attributions. Now, I can say that I can talk about that kind of making unemployed people sacred with a bit of experience behind me, because when in the 1980s, I was actually recruiting people who are unemployed for membership of a political party. And that's exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking, let's harness the energy of these people. And I wasn't realizing that I was just a part of a bigger system that was perpetuating the marginalization. So what happens here is you get conflict and it gets stabilized with the application of a sacred or profane status on the marginalized. Then what happens is you tend to get one of those attributions being made dominant. And the way that happens is through symbolic expressions in rituals. So you see that very clearly with unemployed people. If anybody here in the audience has been unemployed, and I was unemployed for 2 years in the early 80s, when you go and sign on the register to say you're available for work, that is very much an exercise in ritual humiliation. It is telling you that society's dominant value is that you're profane. It is functional for the system. It tells the system that you're available for work, but at the same time, it's also an exercise in ritual humiliation. It has two meanings at the same time. So if that's the theory, I want to switch over now to look at what kinds of strategies you can use to tackle marginalization, because I'm not just interested in this as a nice sociological insight. I'm interested in this really for what benefit it can be to systemic intervention. And I should say one other thing before I actually go on to the intervention side of things. When I first presented this at an ISSS, International Society for the System Sciences keynote back in the year 2000, a woman in the audience just jumped out of her seat and shouted out, "This really represents the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. What would you do about it?" And the whole kind of place just erupted in laughter. I think everybody saw what I saw, which was, some problems are a lot easier to diagnose and solve. But there's a real reason for that, because some of these kinds of marginalizations just have roots in local context and can be shifted. Others actually reflect real societal tensions that are really built into the fabric of society. And you can see that with unemployment, because you have, on the one hand, you've got the kind of capitalist discourse, which requires organizations to look after their own people, but not to deal with things that they can regard as externalities. And then you've got the liberal notion of, in principle, we're all equal. And those two things are in absolute tension, and they cannot be maintained simultaneously unless you keep those things that actually show the contradiction in a marginalized space. So if you were actually to say, no, the unemployed people have to be treated completely equally, the whole capitalist way of doing business would collapse. At the same time, if you were to say, no, we can let unemployed people starve on the streets, then the whole idea of the liberal idea of citizenship collapses instead. So it's kind of functional for society, marginalization, and that makes some of these things very difficult to shift. So moving on to addressing marginalization, I'm going to walk us through a few strategies. The first one is to amplify marginalized voices and create empathic connections. So amplifying marginalized voices is basically about helping those people in the margins to be heard, to think about how marginalized issues can actually be represented in discussions. But I wanted to emphasize that the creation of empathic connections, and that is because if you try to do that amplification without creating the empathic connection, then you can actually get a rebound in the system. Because we have this situation where there are competing attributions of whether things are sacred or profane. If you just try to make those things in the margins sacred, then there'll be a reaction later to increase the profanity. So you can see that, for example, if in the way, sometimes, this is maybe a bit controversial, but in the way that people have sometimes tried to tackle racism, where you've tried to actually just demonize racism and make it a shameful thing for anybody to express any kind of racism. Well, that is, in some senses is a good thing, but if you don't actually tackle the racism itself, it just goes underground. And then you have a Nigel Farage or somebody coming along, and it opens the floodgates and releases it again. So it may be years later that you get the rebound. But that's what happens. And it's only through creating the empathic connections that you can actually begin to really shift this kind of situation. So here's an example from practice. So this is a project that I did with a team of people based at Hull. Alan Boyd and Mandy Brown worked with me on this project. We were asked by 3 voluntary organisations to help design new services for homeless children living on the streets of Manchester. This was back in the late 90s, just moving over into the new decade. And we were told that none of the statutory agencies were actually taking responsibility for this kind of problem. And we had to actually find a way to actually engage with those agencies. But we were also really aware that children living on the streets are in a very marginal position. So they're marginalized in 2 respects. First of all, as children, they're thought of as less rational, less well-informed, if you like, than adults. So we had to think about how we're going to engage them in relation to adults. Also, if they're living on the streets for any length of time, they're going to get involved in petty crime, prostitution, drugs, whatever it is, to enable them to survive on the street. Kids can survive maybe a couple of days on the street, and after that, they're going to need some kind of income. So we're dealing with that kind of double marginalization. Just to tell you what's in this rich picture was part of what we created. This is about a quarter of the rich picture, and it shows the main dynamic that children face. So they're having trouble at school, stress at home or in foster care, so they run away onto the street. Now, there's 2 ways that a child gets picked up. They'll either get picked up by the police or they get picked up by social workers. And I apologise to anybody who's a social worker in the room. I'm afraid that's how the kids wanted to represent the social workers. But the point is that both of those statutory services, the police and the social workers, have a statutory duty to return the child home unless there's an allegation of abuse. And the 2 agencies that children will almost never allege abuse to are social services and the police, because they don't necessarily want to get their parent into trouble, or they don't necessarily want to be bullied when they get back to the foster care for dobbing in a child who's bullying them. So what happens is they get returned home, they run away again, they get returned home. We talked to children who had been through that cycle 20 times in a year. So it's a really wicked problem. So how did we deal with this kind of the marginalization? Well, the first thing we did, before we ever talked to any adults in the system, we went out on the streets at night for 3 months, and we gathered the stories of the children on the streets, and those children really wanted to tell their stories. That actually triggered the first change, because when the Children's Society saw how the children really wanted to engage with us, they actually changed their street work policy, and instead of waiting for the children to come to them, they actually started to go out onto the streets and work with them, and that actually became a national policy, and that happened within the first few weeks of the project. So we captured those children's stories, and we built these kinds of rich pictures. We also built another kind of rich picture, which had the words of the children themselves on it. And actually, when you're sitting in a room with a bunch of agencies who have the ability to turn their backs on this because it's not their statutory duty, and you relate a story, and it's in her own words, of a girl explaining how she got involved in prostitution at the age of 12 in order to stay on the street, it's so compelling that none of those agencies turned their backs on it. They all engage. And this basically comes down to that kind of systems theory that comes from people like Maturana and Varela, theory of autopoiesis, about how a cognition and an emotion are constantly braided together. So if you change people's minds by engaging with emotions, and that moves people into a different space. Now, that doesn't mean you're manipulating people. It means you're just opening up a new space for people to think through the issues. And then they can, of course, take it where they want to go. So we communicated their words, not just ours. We also used the same planning methods when it came to planning solutions with the children as we did with the adults. And there was a view around that we should do a play with the children so they would express the problem, but then the adults design the solutions. And we actually said no to that we wanted the children to be completely involved using the same kinds of methods as the adults. And what we actually found is that the children were much more able to express the solutions that they wanted. And the agencies just said, we can do this. So it was a pretty successful process. We also picked up and used this kind of theory when the children said that they needed a refuge in the center of the city. At that point, we thought, well, this is where you might see a backlash, because retailers might think we're going to bring children who are going to shoplift to the center of the city, and this is going to be a problem. So we did some work with retailers on getting them to think through what this was going to mean for them, and they all basically signed up for it. So let's look at the second strategy. Second strategy is demonstrating the connections between the foci of different people and blurring that primary boundary. So actually beginning to connect up the concerns of the people having a narrow boundary with the concerns of the people having a wider boundary. Let's look at an example of that. So this is a causal loop diagram that comes from a project that my team in New Zealand did. I worked in a government research institute for 7 years in New Zealand. And so the situation, the context is that New Zealand has the highest level of Campylobacter food poisoning in the OECD countries. And there were scientists in our research institute looking at why this was the case. They basically discovered that cows were pooing in the water, and dairy industry is huge in New Zealand. It counts for more than 50% of their exports. So cows were pooing in the water. Stocking rates of cattle were increasing rapidly because it was a profitable industry. And as the Campylobacter bacteria went into the water, it went into the human water system, and human beings picked it up. And they basically, the scientists said, this is what's happening in the system that's causing this level of Campylobacter food poisoning. And it was front page news in the media because with the dairy industry being such a large proportion of exports, anything the dairy industry does is front page news. And the kind of language that the farmers were portrayed in was with phrases like dirty dairy. That was completely marginalizing of the farmers' perspective on this, and they reacted very, very strongly by seeking to marginalize the scientists. So they came right back saying, no, this is a human sewage problem, not an animal sewage problem. And we got a situation where the scientists and farmers wouldn't talk together. Everything that they said went in the media, and it was a very, very difficult situation. And it was threatening to actually undermine the science that was going on in our institute. So the management of our institute came to my team and said, can you do something to get these people talking again? You know, you don't have to solve the problem. It's probably bigger than anything you can do very quickly, but can you get them actually to come into a room together and talk reasonably? So what we did is initially we worked with the different groups separately. And with the farmers, we kind of did models of what human sewage system looked like. With the scientists, we did what the cattle system looked like. There are other bits and pieces in here as well that people were concerned of, including even reserves of Campylobacter in wild ducks. And after people had built their own causal models of what they thought was going on, they felt really quite keen then to come together as a group, because they thought they could justify their perspective to other people. So we brought them together, but instead of asking them to justify their models, we asked them to actually walk around the room and look at all the other models and find variables in those models that connected with things in their own models. So across a morning, we built up this whole diagram. And it began to dawn on people that it's not meaningful to talk about one part of this system in isolation from the rest, that Campylobacter food poisonings flowing through the whole system. And there were multiple points of contact where human beings could possibly get it. So we absolutely achieved that, that goal of getting people to talk reasonably again. Of course, there were still disagreements, but at least we were able to move forward. So the third strategy is uniting against a common enemy. Now, I think the dark side of uniting against a common enemy is fairly obvious. It's what Hitler did in Nazi Germany, uniting the German people against the Jewish people. As I mentioned before, it's kind of Nigel Farage's strategy in the UK to unite half the population against immigrants. But nevertheless, it doesn't have to be a negative. It entirely depends on the context. And of course, that's a matter of judgment, whether the context is going to be right for this kind of strategy. But I can give you an example. And the example I'm going to give you is back in that project with homeless children on the streets. So there was a belief among many of the agencies working with children that the police were really part of the problem, because their primary interest was in catching criminals, and really that they were not that interested in young people, so that they were part of the marginalization. Actually, as a total aside, the police were really, really spot on when they first saw this kind of problem. The police were the ones who actually suggested a solution to it, that they could interrupt this cycle by taking children for private counselling with some of the voluntary organisations. So it was a perception of the police. It was not a reality. The police were really wanting to get to grips with this. We needed to design a workshop with agencies to begin the design process. Once we'd actually done the design work with children initially, we wanted to do some design work with adults too. And it was literally just before this workshop that somebody said to us, you know that one of these voluntary organisations and the police haven't been talking with each other for 18 months. And I said, no, I didn't know that. If I had known that, I would have tackled that before calling a workshop and bringing people in, because you have to think about these kinds of relationships before you set up a workshop. And I contacted these agencies and asked them to come in early, and they came in 30 minutes and early. We all sat down and got them to talk about what the issue was. Well, what the issue was is that a child had died in police custody. And on the news that evening, the voluntary organisation's representative had been interviewed and appeared to be blaming the police for this death in custody. And of course, the police were furious and broke off contact with this agency. What the agency actually managed to explain to the police there is, no, that's not what happened at all. The media took my film and they cut it in such a way that they only said that little bit of the talk that was about the police, and it made it appear like we were blaming the police, and we weren't at all. So they ended up both blaming the media, and there was a lot of laughter, but it made such a difference because they were kind of then in alliance throughout that workshop. And that was a critical alliance that actually helped to solve a lot of the problems later. So let's have another strategy, transcending narrowly focused values. So when you've got a situation of conflict, when there's really two perspectives that are dominating and they're just coming sort of head to head, how can you transcend those narrowly focused values and actually have a bigger canvas? And here's an example of doing that. So this is again one of the projects in New Zealand. We had a team of 6 or 7 people working on this project. And we were asked to run a feasibility study for building a new water storage dam in a drought-stricken area of New Zealand. So this was an area where the dairy industry had expanded significantly and the water had become 60% over allocated. So they were dealing with significant drought situations, and it was threatening to undermine the agriculture in the area. There was real sustainability issues. And we were asked to do a feasibility study for building a new water storage dam. And we took a step back from that. We said, it sounds like you have a solution already, but you wouldn't have asked us to come in if you'd known that that solution was uncontroversial. And they said, yeah, well, that's true. So why don't we suspend judgment on that being the answer, and let's look at a wider set of options, and we'll make sure that the dam gets looked at as an option, but not the only option. And they said, fine. But we were aware of marginalization in this situation. So we've got farmers who are really concerned that community stakeholders, people like kayakers, people interested in hunting and fishing, these kinds of stakeholders would really marginalize the economic interests of the farmers. And likewise, when we talk to community stakeholders, they had the exact opposite. They were saying, are these farmers just going to drive ahead with their dam and marginalize all these other concerns? So we knew we had to develop a method that was going to actually prevent that kind of marginalization playing out in the workshop. And we knew what we had to do was going to be in a very narrow space, a 2.5-hour public meeting. But instead of doing what people normally do in public meetings, which is get the council to propose its preferred solution, and then all the people in the audience just stamp their feet and say no, we went through this kind of process you see on the screen. So we started with presenting key facts about water systems, because we couldn't guarantee that all the community members would understand about things like aquifers connecting rivers underground. We explored the meaning of drought to different stakeholders, and what we discovered is drought meant something to everybody. Drought affected angling, it affected kayaking, as well as affecting the industry. And then we identified relevant values, what matters to people in terms of water, whether it's about the use of water or the value of water in terms of, sort of native ecosystems, beautiful rivers, all of the various things you could think about water. And then we identified options for water management. So you could simply cross-tabulate options with values. We then went into small groups with a big table and asked people to think about each option in relation to all the values that were on that sheet. And it's just surprising how asking people to use a wider set of values than they've thought about previously puts them in a situation where they're thinking through something that they hadn't thought before, and it evolves people's understanding. So on the table I was facilitating, for instance, we had a woman who started out in that discussion saying, I absolutely don't want a dam on any of our rivers. And she learned through that process that there's only so much you can achieve through water conservation measures, which was her preferred solution. That you could achieve about 10% water efficiency, extra water efficiency, and they were 60% over allocated, so that wasn't going to work. So she ended up changing her perspective and said, okay, well, we want a dam then, but what we want to make sure is that a dam is not used then to release so much more land for exploitation that we end up with the same problem again in 10 years' time. So we need a sustainability policy. And that's essentially was the outcome of this whole process. That the community and all the stakeholders basically agreed that there was going to be a dam, and they chose the river that it was going to be on. But they wanted a sustainability policy in place to make sure that this wasn't just the first step in an ongoing process. We actually did a piece of, followed up on some of this work, and it was really interesting because we explored 2 possible dams in the workshop, and the council in its wisdom decided to do another public consultation exercise and put a third solution in there, which was damming a third river that we hadn't talked about. And all of the public outcry was about that third river and not the ones that, that actually talked through. So it's certainly not a scientific test of the usefulness of this, but I think it spoke volumes actually that was the kind of outcome, and they actually went ahead with the one that the community preferred. So second to last strategy is undermining negative stereotypes. I'm going to give you an example of that from New Zealand as well. So this was a project that my colleague Karen Cronin actually ran. She did all of this work on genetic modification in New Zealand before I came into the project. I came into the project in a second phase of it when we were starting to use this work to help industry decide on long-term investments in different kinds of technologies, biotechnologies. And but this first piece of work that she did was at the height of the genetic engineering debate, when it was really controversial. And if you think it was controversial in the UK, if you'd been around in New Zealand at that time, you're talking about major demonstrations in the street, people driving tractors onto the steps of the Houses of Parliament. It was, and a lot of kind of hate crime against scientists, people having their cars daubed with graffiti, bricks through their windows, these kinds of things. It was an ugly time. So again, you've got a real marginalization here. You've got anti-GM campaigners really feeling marginalized by an alliance of science and industry that they felt was just completely sweeping aside their concerns. And you've got also scientists really feeling quite scared because of those kinds of hate attacks and feeling like they were being marginalized in the situation. So what Karen Cronin did was get together leading stakeholders from all of the various camps, of campaign leaders, leaders from companies doing genetic engineering work, leading scientists in this area, Maori, spiritual leaders, a whole range of stakeholders. And she took them through this process, which part of it, which is called the heart of the matter, and I'll explain why in a moment. So you, first of all, you interview diverse stakeholders to determine the values that matter to people. And you get people to order the issues from core to peripheral. So different people will put values in different orders. And you can do this then in two ways: in a purely qualitative way, where people discuss their orderings, or you can actually go away and do some analysis on it. Even you can do some quantitative analysis on it and then bring it back for then people to discuss the implications. What this does though, and the analysis, the kind of cluster analysis you can do on this reveals it, is that it's rarely the case that all stakeholders of one type believe the same thing. There's often quite a lot of heterogeneity among stakeholders, which begins already to nibble away at people's stereotypes. But this is the really big one. When people began to realize that every single stakeholder group put the environment right at the core of the of this diagram, and the anti-GM protesters were really surprised that the scientists actually were doing research on the environmental effects of genetic modification and how and does it actually transfer genetically modified organisms actually transfer the genes via the soil and these kinds of things. The scientists were really concerned about this. So were the campaigners, so were the companies. They didn't want to be investing in something that had major side effects. And it just broke apart those stereotypes, and it enabled that dialogue that actually they not only got much better mutual understanding, but actually began to find ways in which they could take forward policy that all of the stakeholders could agree with. So the final strategy is about establishing rituals to reinforce the secondary boundary. That's basically rituals of inclusiveness. Another example from New Zealand. So this is a project that a couple of us did with the Ministry of Research, Science and Technology. So the Ministry of Research, Science and Technology had developed 4 roadmaps for controversial science and technology investments. So these were going to be 30-year investments, and it was in biotechnology, energy, environment, and nanotechnology. And they had had a lot of stakeholder conflict. So they had basically started putting together these roadmaps and took it out for a public consultation. And there was a lot of kind of shouting saying, this isn't my agenda, you've left my agenda out, that kind of marginalization. Now, the diagram you see on the screen is a conceptual model for using Checklin's technique, but this particular model is about the process that they were using to set up their roadmaps. The only thing you need to know in this is that step 2 was setting up the roadmaps, so forming the steering groups, developing generic tools and templates, collecting evidence. So a lot of the framing was being done before they actually met with stakeholders. And then step 3 was communicating thinking with stakeholders. Well, that's why you got the conflict. The solution, once we'd actually fed back from a lot of stakeholders, was very simple. You actually start consulting the stakeholders before you do the framing. And then we followed them up. They did a 5th roadmap, which was a food roadmap. And food, because food is, it's the biggest industry in New Zealand, it could have been the most controversial, but actually just reversing those 2 steps made a huge difference. And it was a really lovely experience going to some of these public meetings and seeing people engage. So that's a ritual of stakeholder consultation. And I would say the way we used SSM in this case was a ritual of stakeholder consultation. So here's some conclusions. First of all, I think the systems theory is useful for generating insights into marginalization processes. I kind of carry it in my mind all the time so that when I'm encountering these kinds of things, I'm just thinking through the different elements. So if I see one element, I'm thinking, well, where are the other elements in this process? But it's particularly useful for informing systemic interventions, precisely because you can think about these kinds of strategies. But I just want to leave you with one final thought, that the kind of systemic intervention processes that we use are themselves ritual processes that help to challenge marginalization and help us move beyond conflict. And to explain that point, I want to just hop to the work of a sociologist, American sociologist by the name of Randy Collins. He is one of the leading researchers into violence. Now, I'm not saying that our systemic intervention processes deal with violent scenarios in the vast majority of cases, but violence is just an extreme form of conflict. And what he says about violence, I think, actually has a bearing on what we do. So you see, what he talks about is that the vast number of conflictual situations never escalate to conflict. And that is true even of people who have been sentenced for violent crimes in prison. Still 96% of their conflicts don't arise in violence. He wanted to look at what actually triggers the violence. And he said there's 2 things. One is a collapse of the balance of power, that one party sees they can take an advantage and actually strikes first. The other is peer expectations of violence. And the peers don't have to be in the room. They have to be, it has to be that the participants in that conflict believe that other people that they respect would want them to move to violence. So those are the 2 things: collapse of the balance of power and peer expectations. Now think about what we do when we set up workshops. we're really quite fanatical about fair participation. We try to give all the participants equal space. You know, if somebody's not talking, we try to draw out their contribution. And so we're setting up ritual processes to prevent the collapse of the balance of power. We also do things like taking people out of their routines. We put people in a time that's separate, like doing an away day. We often go put people in a space that's separate and an off-site venue, and they develop then their thinking then in isolation from those peers who might want to hold them to account for representing the kind of the normal viewpoint. And we ask people to suspend their judgment and to actually open themselves to learning. This is all about the ritual kind of processes to suspend those peer expectations to allow people to learn. So I think our methods really work on two levels. They work to deal with the subject matter of what it is people need to get to grips with systemically, but they're also working implicitly to prevent conflict and marginalization, and the marginalization that can enable it. So they're both functional and ritually symbolic at the same time. So with that thought, I'll hand over to questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Gerald. Because there are lots and lots of screens and lots of faces, I'm just wondering whether people, in order to make it easier, rather than sticking your hand up or trying to do that thing, just put your question in the chat. And that way, Gerald, you can see the questions and respond to them, and you'll work on a kind of first in, first out, because we only have a few minutes for questions.
I need to get out of the share. How do I do that?
I think if you
got it. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
So just click on the chat if people haven't already done that, and you should see questions. Wow. Then people
there's 48 in there. Okay.
Yeah, and they'll just take it from this point onwards, I think.
Okay, so Shan Turnbull's, we need to replace. Are we going down?
Take it from sort of, if anyone's got a question now, then please pause it.
Yeah,
or else repeat your question. Otherwise,
yeah, I think that'll be easier. It'll be easier. Otherwise, I'll be just shifting.
Yeah, everything else was chat actually during the. Is that John Nicholson? Is it? J Nick.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, John.
Hello, Gerald. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Gerald, you know my questions are always very convoluted, but I'm currently interested in exclusive inclusivity. This is something I'm working on in terms of where you draw boundaries. In other words, creating exclusivity that can, within those boundaries, create inclusivity. And I'm working with the open strategy literature at the moment. And I wonder whether the question I'm going to ask you is how you sort of conceive that within the systems methodology as creating boundaries as a means of creating demarginalization, or as I'm calling it, inclusivity.
Yeah, I mean, what I would be thinking is that the model I presented, like all models, is that it is an oversimplification. So you can have multiple marginalizations overlaying each other. So my immediate response is that you can create inclusion within an exclusive environment, but you also need to ask, what does that exclusive environment create in the wider community? So I think if you keep an eye on that, it can be a positive thing. What you in the days when we used to have men's clubs, very often they would pride themselves on being inclusive, but inclusive only of one gender. And you can see what the consequences of that kind of thing created. So you just have to be aware of that possible side effect.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one last comment, and I'll hand over to another colleague. It's just, in our papers we talked about naive what do we call it? Naive plurality, didn't we? In the papers, and I think this is like naive openness is what I'm challenging. This belief that more and more openness creates more and more inclusivity, and I don't think that's necessarily true. And
this is why Bernard Ulrich's work on boundaries is really interesting, because he doesn't say just open to everything. He talks about justifying in dialogue the setting of boundaries. That's a significant difference. And that was a difference between him and his PhD supervisor, Wes Churchman, because Wes Churchman talked about opening the boundaries as far as possible, but not going for over-inclusion, so it all becomes too complex. And so essentially the widest boundaries are more ethical. And Bernard Ulrich said that's not necessarily the case, that you really have to justify the ethics of setting boundaries, but sometimes narrow boundaries that enable something that can be ethically justified are important. And sometimes you have to, because of resource and time constraints, you have to make those kinds of decisions. The key thing is, can you then justify that to other people?
Thank you, Gerald. I think there's other questions, so thank you for that.
There's a question, Joe, from Louise. In strategy 1, in amplifying marginalized voices, how do you think we ensure we don't just hear inherited narratives from the system, but if people haven't felt they had a voice, then how do we support this?
Sorry, could you read that again? I heard half of it. Ah, there it is. I see it in the text. Okay.
Yeah.
How do you think?
I'm intrigued about just what an inherited narrative is, actually. So
yes, that was my question. I wanted to read that over to. Can Louise just explain that bit of it? And
can you speak, Louise?
Yeah, sure. I suppose I'm just really interested in my research. What I've kind of found, I'm particularly looking at, I suppose, trying to advance the system with mothers in addiction recovery. And what I found sometimes is that they speak often through the frames that they've been given by other professionals in the system, and maybe they haven't always felt that they've had a space to speak. So instead of essentially being able to speak from their point of view, sometimes they inherit the narratives or the roles that they've been given by others in the system.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I absolutely get that. I mean, giving people, whenever I've done I've done a lot of projects in mental health, for example, and I as far as possible, I try to give people confidential space outside the hearing of professionals to allow them to develop their perspectives. I mean, time and space is critical, and sometimes the systems methods as well can help people think through some of the issues so that they can actually, in dialogue, develop their own thinking. But you're right, you know, sometimes somebody just coming into that for the first time, if their only contact has been with a mental health professional, they may well, that's the only understanding that they know, and they need some time and space to develop. I mean, just on that point, actually, on another, in relation to that, taking that a step further, I did a project on housing with older people some years ago, and that was almost a situation that was opposite, that the user community, that the professionals felt that the user community was being dominated by a few activists who were then kind of twisting everything to their perspective, and the professionals were refusing to engage with them because of that. And we did a whole design process on housing services, which engaged both those loud voices, if you like, and ordinary people in care homes together in actually doing a design exercise. And then we did the same with professionals. And it actually opened the eyes of the professionals, because the professionals said, okay, so we actually can work with these people after all, because what they've actually produced is really sensible. And so it actually helped challenge those stereotypes.
Gerald, thank you so much. I think we're come to the end of what we could fit into the session. I had two questions for you, Gerald, though. Is this a red, amber or green presentation in terms of how people should treat it?
It's green.
It's green. Thank you. That's brilliant.